DC voters, I'm Lisa Rice, native Washingtonian, proposer of Ballot Initiative 83. Let's make politicians work harder with 2 changes to our system. 1, let independents like me vote in taxpayer-funded primary elections. And 2, implement ranked choice voting to vote for your favorite candidate and rank your backup choices. Candidates need over 50% to win. Flip your ballot and vote yes on 83. Paid for by Make All Votes Count DC, Philip Pinnell, Treasurer.
I don't think I need to tell you that election 2024 is really heating up. So join me and my co-host Michael Schaefer for a live taping of CityCast DC with WAMU's Tom Sherwood as we dive into the juiciest local election topics of the year. From the fierce clash over ranked choice voting to an indicted council member's scandalous re-election bid. It's all happening tomorrow, October 9th at Black Cat. Doors open at 6:30 and show starts at 7. Check the link in our show notes for more information, and I'll see you there.
Today on CityCast DC, we are talking with DC Councilmember Robert White. He's a member of the council's progressive bloc who leads the council's housing committee. In our conversation, we talked about whether anyone can afford to live in DC, what's going on with the city's homeless programs, and what the government ought to be doing to create more housing in general. Today is Tuesday, October 8th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, council member, thank you for being here.
Michael, I appreciate you having me. Glad to be with you.
So you have been the head of the DC Council's Housing Committee for like 2 years now. What do you think is the biggest issue facing DC housing?
Or how much time do you have? We have a housing crisis right now, and I think this is something that a lot of people are starting to hear about, but more people will. So pipeline of new housing coming online, none, which means housing is going to get more expensive, not less expensive. Some of the nonprofits that build housing without making a lot of profit, some of them are closing down and moving to other jurisdictions. That hurts our affordable housing. And we have a historically high number of people not paying rent, which means that a lot of folks who own and operate buildings aren't able to pay their mortgage. The quality of those buildings will decline over time. You know, all these things together, right, when we still have high interest rates, when labor costs are high, this spells a really big issue for DC, an issue that the rest of the country is facing. But I'm a council member at DC. I chair the housing committee here, so I'm focused on finding solutions here.
So you mentioned this factor of people not paying rent in low-income housing and this threatening the very existence of some of these companies, some of these landlords that operate a lot of the private sector low-income housing. You were a big advocate for, as were a lot of your colleagues, a lot of the protections during the pandemic that made it harder to evict people who hadn't paid rent, made it easier to claim hardship and get out of paying rent. They're still there, and this is what a lot of the landlords are blaming for their plight. Do you have any regrets about that or about keeping it on so long?
Well, I think we did what we needed to do. You know, look, I'm a 5th generation Washingtonian.
You got me beat by 3 generations.
There we go. But look, I like talking to other native Washingtonians. And over the past 20 years, most of my family has been priced out of the city. So when COVID hit and, you know, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm a policy guy. Look at the data. The data was telling us that people who had limited incomes, their incomes were dropping. And people who had higher incomes, their incomes were actually going up during COVID. So rather than see mass displacement of people yet again in the history of DC, we put some protections in place. But those protections can't be in existence forever. And we are seeing signs that there are other protections we need to take a second look at, like the emergency rental assistance program and how it's tied to courts not being able to proceed with evictions. And we've got to take a fresh look at it because like a lot of people, I think first with my heart. But then I run it through my head and my heart says, I don't want to see anybody evicted. Let's protect as many people as possible. But my head says, if landlords can't evict anybody and they can't maintain their properties, they become slums. If they can't pay their mortgages, then those buildings get sold generally to people who are not the best actors. We have some bottom feeders in the housing market who take advantage of people. And I need to look out for people, not just tomorrow and next week, but next year and the year after that. So I think it's time for us to find a balance here. A compassionate one.
You have been a big advocate. It's been sort of central to your political identity for economically vulnerable people in DC. DC also gets criticized, I just know just in my conversations, for being an incredibly expensive city to live at for every income level. Not just for the poorest of the poor, but for your school librarians or your podcast producers or anybody else you can think of. So the sort of big picture question here, which you're sort of touching on, is how do we build a city where not just the unhoused, but also, the librarians and the podcast producers and the bartenders can afford to live?
We can't forget about that. Often the people who advocate for housing really only advocate for people at the lowest end. We've got to pay attention to those middle incomes too. But there are a few things that we can do. One, we've got to keep investing money in building more affordable housing and preserving the housing that we have so it doesn't get sold and turned into luxury condos. But I also think we are in the middle of historic and really exciting shifts nationally. So right now I'm downtown in the John A. Wilson building where the DC Council is, and I look around outside and most of our office buildings are ghost towns, and we will never again need the amount of office space that we needed in 2019, but we sure as heck need as much housing as we can get right now. And so turning our downtown from a glut of underutilized office buildings into communities with parks and schools and grocery stores gives us, I think, an incredible opportunity over the next 5 to 10 years to build out significant housing, to use that as a pipeline for jobs, to reform our economy so that we have nightlife downtown. On the weekends, we have people downtown. We're attracting more tourists. I think what's in front of us is really exciting. And I think housing is the catalyst. But we have got to grab that bull by its horns. We've got to do something that government is not good at, putting ourselves on a timeline, measuring our progress. But we've got to move ahead boldly. So I do see some opportunities right now.
Now, look, I lived in Philly for a while, which has a very vibrant, alive downtown with lots and lots of residents. But they live typically in buildings that were created to be housing. Downtown DC, particularly the west end of downtown, like around Farragut Square and the western part. Most of those buildings were built like in the 20th century to be offices. And people will tell you it's really expensive and sometimes impractical to convert them. How does DC or any city go about convincing owners that this is worth their while and affordable?
First, we have to think outside the box. If I go to New York and Chicago, I'm seeing some pretty cool places that people are living that were not built to be housing. And so first, let's allow ourselves to think outside the box a little bit. The second thing is some buildings can be converted into housing and some can't. The ones that can't, let's look at other conversions because neighborhoods need more than housing. They need schools, they need grocery stores. And when it doesn't fit any of those paradigms, knock them down. Because we've got to move forward. So we're not stuck unless we believe we're stuck. We do have options, but we have got to pursue them. So I think there's a great opportunity. And frankly, I think if we don't reduce the amount of office buildings downtown, our economy is going to suffer for decades. I think about our Rust Belt cities that could not adjust after manufacturing went international. We're at a similar inflection point between remote work, AI technology. We are seeing a shift in how people work and where people work that we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. So let's look at this as an opportunity. Let's think bold, think big, but most importantly, let's execute with the knowledge that we have to focus on building more housing.
The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. has reopened after a breathtaking top-to-bottom renovation. And we're celebrating the voices and achievements of women artists from around the world. Visit now to see Suchitra Matai, Myth from Matter, a new exhibition of richly layered and vibrant paintings, sculptures, and installations that use saris, vintage needlepoints, jewelry, and bindis to imagine a past that lifts up women and people of color. Tickets at nmwa.org. That's nmwa.org.
This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. When I think about October, I think about masks. And no, not the face masks we all wore during the pandemic. I think about Halloween and wearing costumes. For parties, it's all in good fun. But for some of us, This feeling of wearing a mask in our daily lives, pretending to be somebody else, is constant, and it can be draining. That's why talking to a professional who can help is so important. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp makes it easier than ever to take this first step. It's all online. You just fill out a quick questionnaire to be matched with a licensed therapist, and then you design your own plan based around your schedule. And if you ever want to change your therapist at any time, you can, for no extra charge. Take off the mask with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/citycast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/citycast.
So you said at the top that very little new buildings are coming online, right? The pipeline's empty.
Yeah.
And it's such a weird thing because this is a place where clearly there are a lot of people spending a lot of money on real estate, buying houses, buying condos. There's plenty of people with deep pockets coming into the city. And the city is, in the national context, pretty generous about trying to create opportunities for people without deep pockets. Why is there nothing in the pipeline? And more importantly, what can you as a government official do to convince builders that it's worth their while to build in DC, that they'll make some money if they do?
Yeah. Well, there are a few things happening in this data about the lack of new apartment building permits reflecting no residential construction coming online comes from our chief financial officer. What we can do is work to attract more investment in housing in DC in a way that doesn't preclude the average person who works in the tourism industry, who is a teacher, who is a podcast host, from living here. This is a balance that I think we can get right. But there are reasons that housing providers, nonprofit and for-profit, are building in other places and not in DC. And we have a responsibility to digest and then fix those things. Specific things in DC, it is the cost of land, it is the cost of borrowing money, it is some of our regulations that we've got to be bold enough to take a look at. And I think this is a conversation that is bubbling up nationally. I was at the Democratic convention and I was happy to hear a lot of conversation about housing and the need to produce more housing. And people with higher incomes, they have mobility. They can stay in DC, they can move away. But folks with lower incomes, they're going to be left out. It's a game of musical chairs.
So I know we got to do more as a city, but what can you specifically as a lawmaker do to get things rolling in terms of building new stuff for people to live in?
There are a couple things that I can do. One is take a look at those regulations, which is something I'm willing to do. And I've been reaching out to folks in our housing and development community to start to give us some ideas. What are the biggest barriers and what can we do? And I want to package those together probably at the beginning of next year, a package of bills really focused on producing more affordable housing. And by affordable, I mean, middle income and lower income, and protecting the housing that we have. But it's not just like this one bill and we fight over one thing at a time. It's a package of things. And when I introduce that package, I'm going to say, hey, this is how we're going to measure our progress to know whether or not we're on the right track. But I'm also going to keep really driving forward on this vision I have for downtown, because I really do think it's the key. I don't think downtown is going to be the place where most of our affordable housing gets built, because it's just land is expensive. But I do think that building housing downtown can be the lever for reducing the cost of housing in other parts of DC.
But I gotta say, your colleagues on the council in the last few years, just since we've been doing this pod, they have not been shy about putting new regs on. Like, you are currently talking about this bill that would mandate soundproofing for certain new construction in DC. I don't know how expensive that is, but it's an expense, and they add up.
It is.
A couple of years ago, there was legislation to require all new construction to be electric stoves, not gas. Again, that's a little cost, and they add up. These are noble goals, right? One is quality of life, one is environmental and health. But at a certain point, if we think that bringing more housing online is the most important priority for the city, do we have to maybe put aside some of those other goals, or say, like, now's not a very good time to add a reg?
We might. I think that ideas behind a lot of these new regs are laudable. They are important. We also recognize we can't do everything at once. And so I think for the District of Columbia, for 2.5 decades, our revenues grew significantly every single year. And so when that happens for 2.5 decades, you can just kind of start dreaming, what's the next thing we can do? What's the next thing we can do? But that's not where we are now.
Right. Because you're an old time DC guy. You remember what it was like when we were broke.
I do remember the 80s and 90s. We had more crime than money. And so when I first came to the council 8 years ago, we were still rolling economically. And I said, hey, should we be doing some things to prepare for difficult times? Because it's not a question of if, but when. And it just kind of went over people's heads. It just seemed like, things are great. Things are going to be great forever. But now people are more open to that conversation. So all of us, myself included, have to ground ourselves in where we are now, what residents expect us to produce. Average person I represent, they don't know and don't care what all the acronyms are, how much money you put into this program or that program. What they care about is whether or not they can afford to live in a city that they love. And that's where we have to be as representatives. Now, we can't taint the environment as we do it. We can't put people in an unsafe space. But I don't think we really have to make those trade-offs exactly. We do have to be willing to talk to each other and compromise. And one thing that I've learned in positions of leadership is that every challenge creates opportunities. The opportunity here is to pull people to the table, say, look, nobody's getting any home runs today. Let's work together to figure out the path forward, and let's go there. And, anybody who's not willing to do that can't be at the table right now.
Coming down to a more micro level, I know that a lot of people in the sort of housing advocacy world are pretty angry about this mix up with the rapid rehousing vouchers. And not to get too bogged down in the weeds that I'll probably get wrong anyway, but my understanding is the criticism is basically that they say the Bowser administration is not a trusting partner on housing programs to get people off the street. What do you make of that critique?
It's true. The Mayor Bowser is not been a trusting partner in housing. There have been a lot of roadblocks to helping these families in rapid rehousing. The most recent one is silly, sloppy, and ridiculous. The council funded vouchers after the mayor put up brick walls for every other solution. And 3 months after we passed the budget, she said, oh, no, that money doesn't actually exist. Well, we got the budget numbers from the agencies. We verified them with the city's chief financial officer. We passed the budget and months passed. And so this is, I think, silly, and it makes the city look bad. But the other big thing, and this is really important, the rapid rehousing program is for families in shelter that make moderate incomes. And the idea is you put them in housing and subsidize it for a year and a half. They increase their incomes and they take over the rent. But almost no family succeeds at the end. But then they get put back out of that housing and they go into shelter or sleeping in somebody's couch. So when you are a parent and you have to tell your kid, yeah, I'm working 2 jobs, but you're going to lose that room, the first bedroom that you had in 2 years. And you have to say that to your child. I have 2 daughters, 5 and 8. That has to be heartbreaking. So rather than keep insisting on a broken program, let's start to check our work, see what works, what doesn't, and stop putting people into a failing program. So I'm trying to create a safety net for those families because I believe they are doing what they were supposed to do in this program, but the government didn't live up to its side of the bargain.
So inside the government, can you give me a sense of what systemic changes you would propose to even out the balance of powers so that you're not in this kind of loggerheads with the mayor again?
Well, balance of power exists in democracy. It's just that every part of government has to work together. And that's a place we've had a really difficult time over the past decade in DC. It can't be, the executive, whether it's the mayor or governor, and then the legislative body doing their own things. There has to be some cohesion. I just think we need more cohesion between the legislative branch and the mayor's office. That's going to get us a lot further. I think the more folks focus on credit and politics, the more we're going to miss the mark. And my hope is that the difficult times that we're wading through right now are going to force people to the table.
So you mentioned how non-payment of rent is really imperiling some of these landlords, some of these housing providers, particularly who offer apartments for low-income people and affordable housing. And they need to have an easier time putting people out or somehow incentivizing people to actually pay. There's also been a string of lawsuits in the past year against like bad landlords, for lack of a better word. How do you think the city's handling the tenant protections? Like, where's the balance, and do you think we're meeting it?
We're not meeting the balance exactly. I think our agencies are supposed to enforce building conditions issues. We do have the laws on the books. I commend our Attorney General, Brian Schwab, for stepping in when some of these are starting to sue some of these bad landlords. And I work with the housing providers, and most of them, they don't want to protect the bad landlords either. I will continue to look for ways to strengthen our laws. One bill that we passed that was introduced by Chairman Mendelson allows our inspection agencies to go in proactively to examine the conditions of buildings so that we're not finding out once it's sort of too late to help. And so things like that help, but they do have to be implemented, and we have to be able to fund them, which means we need to keep our economy strong.
So during your tenure as the Housing Committee Chairman, a new DCHA, that's DC Housing Authority Director, was named. He's coming up on his 1-year anniversary in the role. What kind of grade would you give him, and why?
I'd give Director Keith Pettigrew a B. And the reason I would give him a B is because, one, I think he moves with a sense of urgency. He has been receptive both to the concerns that I've raised and the council have raised, but also I hear from residents that they reach out to him and his team, and they've gotten responses, open ears to fix problems. He comes with experience, and he brought on a new executive team, which I think was very necessary for the agency. But he did inherit an agency with a lot of problems that have lingered for a lot of years. So there's still a good amount of work to do, and I want to make sure I leave room for improvement. And I also want people to know I'm not going to be easy on him. I'm as hard on him as I was on his predecessor, but I think he welcomes the criticism, and I appreciate that type of partnership. So I think he's doing a really good job. I track metrics for my agency, so it's not just about how I feel. How quickly are you fixing problems that tenants complain about? How quickly are you getting housing units back online? That's the type of thing that I track. And then when they're not moving it fast enough, I ask them, why not? And the director will say, well, because we need more firepower. And I say, well, what are you doing about it? And he says, well, we're going to hire more contractors. And I'll say, when are you going to hire? He says, we're going to be signing contracts next week. And then the following week, I'll follow up, and those contractors will be hired. So I keep a really close eye on him and his team and their work. I do walk-through visits, sometimes surprise walk-through visits of various properties. And I like what I'm saying. Again, not perfect yet, but moving in the right direction.
I'm curious, when you do a walkthrough visit, unless I'm misinformed, you're not yourself a construction engineer or a building expert. What do you look for? And how do you, as a public official, kind of BS detect to make sure that they're not pulling the wool over your eyes?
That's a great question, Michael. So before this director, with the previous director, I went to a property, and a tenant invited me in her unit. And she was complaining about a hole in her wall. And she said it had been there for something like 3 or 6 months. And the maintenance person was there, the agency director was there. And I'm saying, why is it taking so long? And they'd given me some excuses. And then I said, why does it look like your kitchen had a fire? And they said, oh, that happened years ago. And I said, well, can you turn on the light? Can you turn on the light so I can see it? And they say, the light doesn't work. It hasn't worked since the fire. And so I'm asking the maintenance person, I'm like, when you came to look at this hole in the wall, why didn't you look at this like scorched kitchen and the light that doesn't work? And he said, well, that's not what they reported. So I don't need to be a formal inspector to see BS. But conversely, with the new director, I will go to a building, and there was a one in a different part of town, and one of the buildings was offline. It was a smaller building, but you could tell that the door was broken and there was a lot of junk inside. And I said to the director, why is this building, if no one is living in this building, why is this door accessible? Doesn't this create a hazard? He said it absolutely does. And he asked his team, why is this door still open? And they started giving them excuses about process. He said, I don't want to hear the excuses. I want the door closed. Can this be closed in the next 2 days? Yes. Okay. And, and so that's how I gauge sense of urgency and process. But, those kind of give me the feeling about what's happening, but I still want to see the data. And so between those two approaches, I feel like I have a good idea of what's happening and what's not happening.
So 2 years ago, you ran for mayor, which is a job that would have made you the boss of these agency heads rather than just a councilman who does some oversight.
Yeah.
Any interest in doing that again next time?
I am interested. I ran for mayor because I have a vision for the city. And once I saw that vision, I can't unsee it. Like, I love this city, but I don't love the distance between where we are and the potential that we have. And I think we're at a historic moment. I'm a person of faith. And so, I believe that, everything in God's time. And I think 2 years ago, people were still somewhat comfortable, or at least optimistic that we would be comfortable soon. That's not a great space for me as a leader. When people are uncomfortable and realize that like systems and structures are broken, that's a better space for me, because I can say, look, here's my vision for how we're going to get it done. Here's the role that you play. Here's how you can hold me accountable, because here are the benchmarks I'm trying to meet. And so I think if it is to be, I would be really excited to lead this city. But right now, I'm going to do everything I can as a council member and more. I'm always trying to up my game as a council member, and there's still plenty that I can do here.
Wait, so do you think the city is going in that uncomfortable direction?
People are very uncomfortable. I think people recognize city services are going back to where they were in the 90s. Violent crime has gone down, but it is still much higher than any of us are comfortable with. I think people don't understand the cohesive vision for the city, a cohesive vision for downtown. And I just think that the structure that former Mayor Williams put in place some 2 decades ago, like any other structure and system, it is just starting to wear over time. And I think people are getting nervous that we are meandering and not really focused on a vision with the right leaders in place.
Councilmember, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, Michael. I appreciate you having me. Love the podcast.
After the interview, we gave Mayor Bowser's administration a chance to respond to Robert White's criticisms of her approach to affordable housing in D.C. Laura Zeilinger, the director of the D.C. Department of Human Services, sent us the following statement. When Mayor Bowser came into office, the district had a system that only ensured access to shelter when legally required during hypothermia season and relied on D.C. General to meet our legal mandates. Today, we have a system that offers efficient and cost-effective prevention through our homelessness prevention program, provides safe and supportive shelters in environments that are welcoming for families through our small community-based short-term family housing programs, and invests in interventions that have resulted not only in a 78% reduction in family homelessness, but more importantly, in a system of care that is predictable and reliable for families. The statement goes on. The mayor has made unprecedented investments in homelessness prevention and short-term family housing, including a more than $30 million a year increase in rapid rehousing this year to support more than 2,000 families with services like enhanced case management and connections to long-term housing. That's it. This episode is our contribution to the DC Homeless Crisis Reporting Project in collaboration with other local newsrooms. The other stories are linked in our show notes. Check them out. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter, Hey DC. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.